Okay, today I'm going to walk you through how to think like a software engineer when it comes to solving coding challenges. So the first thing that you want to do is define the problem. You want to have a clear idea of what the problem is. If the problem's too big, if it has unknowns, that's okay. Just break those into smaller components of the problem and then work on them as you go. Solve the ones you know how to first, and then attempt to solve the unknown components second. And you'd be surprised sometimes how far you can get just doing the stuff that you do know how to do and then trying to put it back together. Second thing you want to do is you want to define the limits, restrictions, constraints of the problem. And then also checking, do things depend on each other? From there, you can develop your strategy and your approach to solving the problem. So at this point in solving a coding challenge, this would be writing out some pseudocode. And from there, you can move on to your algorithm. And in your algorithm is when you actually want to write your code. And then after you've written your algorithm, you want to test it. So we'll run through Fizzbuzz. Fizzbuzz is a really common coding challenge, and if you haven't seen it before, essentially Fizzbuzz just wants you to write a function that console logs numbers 1 to n being your variable. But for multiples of 3, you want to print fizz instead of the number, and for multiples of 5, you print buzz instead of the number. And then for numbers that are multiples of both 3 and 5, you need to print Fizzbuzz. So the example for this should look something like this. This would be the example function you call, and then it should console log 1, 2, fizz, 4, buzz. So instead of 3, it's printing fizz, and instead of 5, it's printing buzz. So first up, defining the problem. That's pretty easy for most coding challenges because coding challenges almost always will define the problem for you. But if when that's the case, what you want to do here is make sure that you are very clear on the instructions and the expected result, and then also breaking down this into smaller components. So for here, we have a function. The function console logs 1 through n. And then if n is a multiple of 3, you print fizz. If it's a multiple of 5, you print buzz. And if it's a multiple of 3 and 5, you print fizzbuzz. So all we did here is basically redefine the problem up here, and I find that it's helpful to redefine that myself as I'm walking through it, because sometimes, as you may or may not know, but sometimes reading these types of coding challenges via text, a couple of sentences, maybe there's 3-4 sentences, they're not always very clear or very readable. So I like to rewrite them. Second thing we want to do is define limits. So the main limit of the fizzbuzz problem here is you want to print fizz, buzz, or fizzbuzz instead of the number. So now we can essentially write down our pseudocode. And then we can write our algorithm, and then we can test it. Okay, so now I'm over here at jsbin.com, and I've already defined the problem up here. So next thing we want to do is go ahead and write our pseudocode is in our plan. So first thing we want to do is write out function fizzbuzz for the function. And then what we're doing in here inside of our function is we want to for loop through n, and then we want to see if I, so it'll divisible by 3, and if it is, console log fizz. If I is divisible by 5, and if it is, we want to console log buzz. And then if I is divisible by 3, or if I is divisible by 5, console log fizzbuzz. Otherwise, we want to console log out the number, which is n. And that's our pseudocode right there. So let's comment this out. So the next thing we do, so now that we have pseudocode or our plan of action here, so this is our plan of action, we want to actually write out our algorithm. So we can start out by writing out function Fizzbuzz. And what we want to do is write our for loop. So for I equal 1 is less than or equal to n, increment I plus plus. And then we're going to write out our if statements. So if I is divisible by 3 and that equals 0, so we want to console.log fizz. Else if I divided by 5 has a remainder of 0, console log buzz. Else if I divided by 3 and I divided by 5 equals 0. Oops, we forgot that there. Console log Fizzbuzz. Otherwise, we simply want to console log I. And let's delete our spaces here. So now that we've written out the algorithm, we're not done. Now we need to test it. So this is pretty simple. We could go over here and just hit run. And what's going to happen right now? Well, nothing, because we didn't call the function. So we need to make sure, oops, we don't declare a function. We just need to call the function. So Fizzbuzz, and in this case, we can just throw in 31 there. And we will see what that does. And that's why you want to test things and make sure that it actually works. So when we run this, let's see what we get. So write a function that console logs numbers 1 to n. And in this case, n is 31. So we have 1, 2, 3, because I divided by 3, or I is divisible by 3 here. So this is divisible by 3. So fizz gets printed 4. So 5 for 5 buzz gets printed. But then we have another fizz here for 6. 7, 8, fizz, buzz, 11, fizz, 13, 14, fizz. So it's looking pretty good, except we don't have Fizzbuzz logging here. And what's supposed to happen is if I is divisible by 3 and if it's divisible by 5, so if n, rather, is divisible by 3 or 5, it should print out Fizzbuzz, but it's not. So this is actually kind of a trick question if anybody has never done this before. Fizzbuzz is a little bit of a trick question. You need to have practiced it before. Otherwise, this is what you get here. This is pretty confusing. Well, why doesn't this work? It looks like it should work. It is printing out, fizz and Fizzbuzz when it's supposed to. Well, essentially what's supposed to happen up here, and the trick to this one is, what we want to do is we want to write out if I is divisible by 15, because 3 times 5 is 15. So it's essentially the same thing as if 3 and divisible by 5. So if that number is divisible by 3 and 5, same thing as if the number is divisible by 15. and Fizzbuzz. So we'll throw that in there. And this is now an else if. And we can now remove this line here. Do that correctly there. There we go. Okay, now go ahead and run it again. And this time you can see that it is indeed printing out Fizzbuzz when it's divisible by 15, and the same thing down here, printing out Fizzbuzz when it's divisible by 30. So remember, what you want to do is define the problem. If the problem's too big or if it has unknowns, break it into smaller components. Define the limits, constraints, and restrictions. Strategize your approach, or in the case of solving whiteboard or other algorithms, go ahead and write out some pseudocode there, run your algorithm, and then make sure you test it. And if the test fails, then go ahead and you can essentially repeat the entire process.